In 1499, the abbot of Sponheim wrote a letter to his Carmelite friend Arnold Bostius, claiming to have been revealed, divinely revealed something incredible. An art by which to create unbreakable ciphers, to learn Latin in only a couple of hours, the ability to conjure angels and employ them to instantly dispatch messages at vast distances, even to transmit one's thoughts over those vast distances, even deep into the most secure dungeon. Indeed, it was an art that would eventually illuminate the soul itself, mystical illumination. This art of Steganographia revealed to the abbot Trithemius would, quote, be marveled at by the entire world, as he wrote to his friend Bostius, who, as bad luck would have it, died right before the letter arrived. And the prior there in Ghent read the letter with abject horror. This was baldly the conjuration of spirits, demons really, to engage in subterfuge, criminal necromancy praised as divine revelation by one of the most educated men of the church of that day. And thus, Trithemius's reputation as a dark sorcerer burst onto the scene of the 16th century. But what exactly is the art of the Steganographia? Is it angel magic or demonic conjuration hiding something deeper still? What exactly was the magical theory and practice of Trithemius, probably the most learned person in the study of the occult in his day? He was the teacher of Agrippa, the inspiration to Dr. John Dee, foundational for the would-be Rosicrucians, and the founder of modern cryptography. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for explorations and topics of esoteric history. And if you'd like to support this work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content, then I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon or considering picking up some of the cool merch we here have on the channel. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to get a reliable lay of the land, make sure to check out my study guide, which is also freely accessible. And if you're interested in actual historical books on magic and the occult, check out Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now let's explore at some significant depth the world of ciphers, angel magic, spiritual illumination, and practical prophecy, the world of Trithemius. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Born in 1462, from a young age, Johann Heidenberg, later became known as Trithemius, was deeply, even rebelliously dedicated to learning. This was deeply opposed by his stepfather, and the young Johann would sneak out in the night to learn the alphabet and then bits of Latin before entire prayers and smatterings of grammar. Still learning to read at the age of 15, he was shown a vision where he could choose between a written tablet and one with only pictures on it. And he chose the tablet with the writing, and at the age of 17, he just ran away from home, seeking further education, roaming between Trier, the Netherlands, and Cologne before he eventually settled at the University of Heidelberg for formal education, apparently rapidly matriculating. However, after being caught in a snowstorm and taking refuge in the nearly ruined abbey at Sponheim in 1482, he would come to settle there as a neophyte before being elected only a year later at the tender age of 21 as abbot. Elected due in part to his education, but also for his zeal and probably being young enough to be manipulated by the elder monks there, Trithemius set to reform, rebuild, and expand Sponheim. In particular, Trithemius radically expanded the abbey's library from a measly 48, though that's still respectable at this time, but from 48 to over 2,000 volumes with significant holdings on occult topics. He was apparently known for his strictness, being especially resented by his monks for insisting upon still producing handwritten copies of volumes, despite the advent of the printing press during his lifetime. Indeed, by 1505, he would resign his position, probably quitting as much as being ousted, at the age of 43 before becoming the abbot of St. James at Würzburg, a Scottish monastery of all things. In that position he would hold until his own death in 1516. Trithemius was extremely productive as a writer, with his own administrative tasks, along with composing numerous works on monastic history, annals of Germanic history, chronicles which honestly at times border on historical fiction more than anything else, various works on spirituality, works on monastic reform, and works alone that would earn him, if only he were known for that, as one of the great early monastic humanists. But the writings of Trithemius also reveal a kind of internal tension, even seeming contradiction between his noted demonological writings and his own specifically occult works. But to understand this, it's worth taking stock of the development of the world of the occult around him in the last third of the 15th century, a period of utter dynamism in both the demonological context and in the rise of the occult philosophy. So on the one hand, we have the mature demonological worldview concerning diabolical witchcraft, which was beginning to solidify into what scholars now call the elaborated theory of witchcraft, along with the maturity of demonic magic, alchemy, and astrology as inheritances from the medieval period. Now, I have done a lot of episodes on the development of the witch idea, but suffice to say, this was a shift from witchcraft merely understood as sin to now being understood as a worldwide woman-led diabolical heresy bent on the destruction of Christendom, most infamously stated in the 1486-87 Malleus Maleficarum. And while Kramer's position on witchcraft was especially misogynistic and even psychopathic, there's a reason why the Malleus became as popular as it did. It clearly synthesized prime material, it diagnosed what people took to be the current state of the worst of the witch-infested world, and provided the means by which this heresy could be combated in a way that allowed its audience to make sense of the world around them. The Malleus wasn't popular for no reason. And again, if you want more on the Malleus, you can check out my episode if you want to understand that important and rightfully infamous text. But given what I'm sure many of you know about Trithemius' occult works, you may be surprised to learn that his demonological convictions were shockingly similar to those found in texts like the Malleus, primarily worked out in works of his like the Intipulus Maleficiorum, the Liber Octo Questionum, and his unfinished textbook De Demonibus. But in short, Trithemius' position was that demonic manifestation really only occurs with human cooperation or invitation, or just through active sin, especially lust, or through passive sin, mostly in the case of men, through the sin of acedia. Now, you know, the idle hands are the devil's workshop, that kind of idea. Demons only operate through trickery for Trithemius, praestigiis, and God allows such demonic molestation to occur to test the free will of his subjects. Contrasted to demonic trickery, of course, are miracles, directly caused by God in violation of natural law, and marvels, caused by God or angels through a human agent. Keep this concept of marvels handy, it's going to matter a lot in a moment. Unlike other scholars, Trithemius rejects the notion of marvels produced merely by natural magic, arguing that such feats must have some kind of underlying supernatural causation. Thus, natural magic is at root always either angelic or demonic. He's especially concerned with learned demonic magic, which he believed was simply endemic among the clergy of his time. That is, the using the force of the sacramental exorcism to bind and manipulate demons for various ends. Which again, following Augustine, he rejects that demons have magical knowledge, for instance, of where buried treasure is, rather they're just really ancient and have been storing up riches for the coming of the Antichrist. Yes, buried treasure is for most medieval demonology a kind of demonic credit union for the coming of the Antichrist, such that the demons reveal these riches, or at least tempt people with these riches to greedy clerics, to tempt them into luring them to their deaths or other kinds of vicious traps, or just more into the world of greed, and eventually damning their soul. Or, my favorite that he mentions is that demons can use glamour magic to turn treasure into manure, resulting in, hilarity for everybody. Haha, joke's on you, it wasn't magic, it was just poop. Beside the Middle Ages being mostly poop jokes in D&D. At any rate, Trithemius was complaining constantly about the clerical necromantic underground is admittedly pretty rich, as we'll see. As for witches, Trithemius' position is pretty straightforwardly Augustinian with a touch of the misogyny of texts like the Malleus. The ethical and spiritual weakness of women, inherited to them from Eve, makes them more likely to fall for demonic trickery more generally. The specific demon associated with witchcraft for Trithemius is the light shunner, the lucifugum, the light fleer, which he avoids light, but he also avoids the aerial region where sound is transmitted, and thus he's better suited to the unlearned sorcery of women, which doesn't rely on the complex incantations of those clerics engaged in the necromantic underground business. Along with the standard litany of malevolent witchcraft, which includes, of course, infanticide, meteorological evils, inducing various illnesses such as blindness, epilepsy, insanity, especially demonic poisoning to cause such a condition, and then the witches using a cure to have power over life or death, or at least apparently have that power, Trithemius, like Kramer, is taken with the sexual powers of the witch to paradoxically both nullify procreation, making the virile member vanish, as witches were apparently wont to do, but also to inflame lust through unnatural sexual acts and demonic copulations with succubi and incubi. While Trithemius admits that women suffering from melancholia, what we would now denote as a wide range of mental illnesses, are more likely to be subjects of demonic temptation, such a condemnation doesn't negate their free will, and thus is not exculpatory. However, unlike Kramer's Malleus, Trithemius spends a lot of more time investigating and castigating the range of learned forms of magic, especially Solomonic magic, natural magic, alchemy, and astrology. Unlike others of his time, Trithemius argues that such books of sorcery should be collected and studied to better understand their enemy, rather than just consigned to the pyres. Thus, learning about necromancy wasn't the problem for Trithemius. Practicing it was. Further, it was necessary to combat those charlatans that falsely claimed to produce marvels, thus leading the masses into more and more sinful delusions. Here he singles out none less than Dr. Faustus, that self-styled fountain of necromancy, as a fraud who should be chastised with whips. You can check out Trithemius' OnlyFans for more on that. In fact, Trithemius says that he and Faust actually stayed at the same inn at Gelnhausen in 1506, and then when Trithemius tried to call Faust out, like Tombstone style, but with necromancers, I guess, Faust fled in fear of being publicly revealed as a fraud by the Black Abbot, at least as far as Trithemius tells it. I'd like to hear Faust's side of the story. Another figure to earn Trithemius' condemnation is the bizarre Hermetic Messiah Giovanni Mercurio da Correggio. This guy was so strange that historians just didn't think he existed until recently. At any rate, this Mercurius Secundus, as he was known, the second coming or reincarnation of the Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus, claimed to have had divine wisdom. He produced marvels, allegedly, and even convinced the first self-styled Hermeticist, Lodovico Lazzarelli, of his powers. Recording a visit of de Correggio to France in 1501, Trithemius basically thought he was delusional, self-aggrandizing, crazy person, a pretender more than a necromancer with some adjunct of mental illness, but perhaps, low-key in league with demonic forces. So Faustus and Correggio didn't really strike Trithemius of much note whatsoever. Of course, as I noted a moment ago, Trithemius also held that there were people who were attempting to use the power of exorcism as a means by which to manipulate demonic forces, classic Solomonic binding magic. And Trithemius had perhaps one of the greatest collections of just those manuals in history, deeming them either spiritual traps, dangerous nonsense, or trifled which should be collected and studied rather than burned. However, of his vast collection of magical manuals, 39 treating explicit demonic magic and 37 treating implicit demonic magic and many, many others besides, there he seems to tread with a bit more of a light touch. And the works ascribed to Peter Abano and his magic of celestial spirits as laid out in texts like the Heptameron and the Conciliator the text of Raymond Lull, like the Ars Combatoria, by which metaphysical truths can be deduced through a series of mystological calculations, and the Ars Notoria, by which memory and eloquence can be enhanced, and through which the liberal arts rapidly could be acquired through the contemplation of magical symbols filled with incantations. These three texts stand out for Trithemius as being partially true and partially vain, with some genuine, profound mystical truths mixed in with so much superstition. Now, for what it's worth, I've made episodes on the Heptameron, on Albano's Conciliator, and on the Ars Notoria, if you want to check those out to get more into these texts that Trithemius thought were at least partially redeemable, though I still do need to cover Raimundo Lull, though. He's just so intimidating. At any rate, alchemy and astrology were also targets of specific criticism for Trithemius. He denotes alchemy as the casta meretrix, the chaste whore, whose seductions promise delights, but despite payment after payment, she never delivers on the goods. Early modern Germans were as vulgar as they were clever. Ain't that right? Looking at you over there, Paracelsus. And you, Martin Luther. Although I don't think I have any Martin Luther. Yeah, you, Martin. At any rate, the alchemists were for the most part either dupes or frauds. However, despite his disdain for most of alchemy, he will deem the famed Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus as containing authentic alchemical secrets, which I'll discuss here in just a bit. Astrology for Trithemius was a bit of a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it could eject free will and become just anathema to Christian doctrine, and on the other hand, the planetary intelligences through which God communicates astrological information could become entities of worship and glorification, thus opening the door to what scholars now call astral necromancy, the kind of stuff that got people like Cecco d'Ascoli burned. Yes, I have an episode on him as well. While Trithemius held that the planetary intelligences, which I'll come back to in a minute, most often identified with angels, did structure the cosmos so as to inform the process of history, astrology, probably understood, was more akin to prophecy than pagan divination for Trithemius. The upper airs were also just home to a host of demonic entities that you had to be careful with. Thus, improper worship of celestial entities could be intercepted by demonic entities and used to manipulate and eventually damn the would-be astral necromancer. Thus, astrology was very important for Trithemius, but also, like alchemy and Marvel-producing natural magic, was more akin to walking a metaphysical tightrope than simply taking the whole thing at once. Alright, that's Trithemius' position in the context of Northern and Central European occultism and demonology in and around the 1480s, 1490s or so. The primary takeaways being his relatively typical but tremendously educated position on demonic magic and witchcraft, a largely negative but nuanced view of alchemy and astrology. However, he did accept that marvels can be produced through natural magic with both angelic or demonic assistance. This position is that there's no purely natural magic isn't really typical of anyone of the period, but for Trithemius, behind any marvel is either an angelic or demonic associate. Finally, Trithemius seems to accept that there is at least some truth in the celestial magic and worldview, the sort of structure of the cosmos laid out by Peter Albano, the computational mysticism of Raimundo Lull, and the rapid acquisition of knowledge through symbols of the Ars Notoria. Yeah, if you know what's coming, but we're not there yet. We got to get there. Remember when I said that to understand Trithemius, we have to have one hand to take stock of the development of the world of the occult around him in the last third of the 15th century? Well, we just covered that one hand. We have the mature demonological worldview concerning diabolical witchcraft, which was again beginning to solidify into what scholars now call the elaborated theory of witchcraft, along with a more mature position on medieval demonic magic, alchemy, and astrology as the inheritances again of the medieval world for Trithemius. But what's the other hand? The other hand is the Hermetic Kabbalistic revolution flowing out of Italy. Beginning in the 1460s or so, an enormous volume of ancient Greek wisdom, such as the works of Plato, but especially the mystical literature associated with Neoplatonism, along with what was to be taken as the primordial Egyptian wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, was being translated by Marsilio Ficino into Latin for the first time for Western scholars. And around the same time, Jewish Kabbalistic texts were being commissioned for translation by people like Pico della Mirandola, also making them available for a wider readership for the first time. Much of this Hermetic, Kabbalistic, Platonic, Pythagorean revolution would be exported across the Alps by the German scholar Johannes Reuchlin, whose texts like De Verbo Mirifico on the wonder-working world and De Arte Kabbalistica would prove foundational for non-Jewish Kabbalah, including eventually the development of occult Kabbalah centuries later. And indeed, it would be Reuchlin that would introduce Trithemius to these Italian developments, perhaps there at Heidelberg when he was a student, specifically to Pico's notion that true magic was simply marrying heaven to earth, an idea shared by Hermeticism and Kabbalah, and that it was the practical side of magic which actually proves the truths of Christianity. Further from Reuchlin, Trithemius would come to understand that the manipulation of language, especially the Hebrew divine name and angelic names, could bring to bear marvelous changes in the terrestrial world around us. This idea, spelled out in Reuchlin's On the Wonder-Working World, claimed that the divine name, in Hebrew Yod He Vav He, with a shin placed into the center, thus spelling out a name a bit like Jesus, Yehoshua, had the power to transform and perfect nature, an idea found in the New Testament. Further, this linguistic mysticism could also be applied to a Pythagorean understanding of numbers, or mathematicals more generally, as a kind of divine language all its own. Leaning into all of this Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Pythagorean ideas, sometime in the 1490s or so, this would all be brought together into one occult theory, brought on by the arrival of a vision for Trithemius, the second big vision of his life, and a relatively strange visitor to the abbey at Sponheim. In 1495, a certain Libanius Gallus, really Fernando of Cordova, who seemed to Trithemius to have an encyclopedic knowledge of virtually everything, a vast and exact memory along with fluency in numerous languages including Aramaic and Hebrew, claimed to have gained his abilities after he rejected earthly riches and went to learn the arcane from a Majorcan hermit monk named Pelagius. Now, exactly what was taught to Trithemius isn't clear, but these occult teachings do survive in some manuscripts that I'm going to be making another episode on. But they seem to have included the nature of good and evil spirits, how to produce a specific exorcism powder, and various mysteries of nature. At around the same time, Trithemius is actively experimenting with some combination of alpha-numerical manipulation in combination with some form of angelic astrological elections. The exact nature also isn't clear. The cauldron out of which his theory is a bit vague to us. But contemplating all of this, Trithemius tells us that he fell into a sleep vision whereby a shadowy entity informs him that he is actually on to something important, a marvelous key that is impossible for the human mind to sort out by their powers alone. Thus, this entity revealed the theory and practice of this system combining Kabbalah, Pythagoreanism, Hermetic cosmology, alchemical symbolism, and angelic magic that Trithemius would eventually call the Steganographia, the hidden writing. This art would find expressions in 3 works of the abbot of Sponheim, an incomplete work by that title in 2.5 books, 2 books and a fragmentary 3rd book, the Polygraphia and De Septem Secundes, or on the 7 secondary intelligences. So let's now get into the Steganographia, but as a theory and practice in a general sense, but also as its particular expression in that infamous eponymous work. While preparing the text that became the Steganographia as we know it, Trithemius composed a series of letters from around 1503 to 1507 that increasingly expressed his emergent theory of magic. The first of those letters, to Prince Johannes of Westerberg, expressed Trithemius's deep connection of Pythagorean and Kabbalistic numeral speculation with the practice of magic. That is, of the union of beings such that the primeval monad gives rise to the decad, and then to the ternary, the quaternary, the denary, and finally to the realm of multiplicity. to the world all around us. Think the Pythagorean tetrachus meets the Kabbalistic sphirot here. The point being that no ontological dignity is lost in the transition from the one to the many. Thus, those of us who dwell in the world of the many, in the world of becoming, can wield the power of the original one, at least under certain conditions. But this link from the realm of becoming and multiplicity back to the realm of being and the one allows for such marvelous feats as curing the sick, combating demonic forces, and engaging in prophecy, knowing the future. But how is this return to the one affected? By some combination of internal spiritual and moral purification and divine illumination in turn, though Trithemius is obscure on both of these points. However, he does forward that the simplicity and purity of monastic life is a surer foundation for such purification and illumination, so you might need to be a monk. Further, he argues to von Westenberg that even if one did obtain all the books of magic, you knew all the prerequisite astrology, and have knowledge of all the secret seals of all the supernatural creatures, it would all be for naught without the proper moral and spiritual purifications along with that divine illumination. Thus, again, books of magic are simply inert without the proper use, and they shouldn't be burned then on principle. Further, if one isn't going to engage the work of deepening faith and virtue, there's no reason to waste one's time and money on such volumes in the first place. Here, Trithemius develops a kind of three principal magical virtues: faith, virtue, and knowledge, and only those combined in the magus, or the astrologer, or the alchemist, will allow them to prove their art successfully. Faith, moral virtue, and knowledge all combined somehow can trigger divine illumination. Similar sentiments are actually echoed in his other epistle to Joachim of Brandenburg in 1503, but here Trithemius details just why magic has such a poor reputation those days. Most practitioners are simply foolish or fraudulent, then diabolical. Not that the devil doesn't use their stupidity and fraud to his own ends, and secondly, when the foolish would-be magus inevitably falls, they do turn to diabolical aid for success, doubly condemning themselves as not only stupid, but damned. He laments that the magia sancta et bona, the sacred and good magic, has largely been forgotten, and he hopes that it can be returned to its former purity by a kind of magical reformation. And to that end, Trithemius actually enumerates 11 rules of magic. That is to say, he thinks one should be naturally disposed to its practice, to understand its technical vocabulary, to obtain all the appropriate books that you would need, to get a good teacher unless you've been graced with divine illumination. You understand the relationship of the macrocosm with the microcosm, a very hermetic principle here. You learn all the proper astrological timings and their sympathies. You know which spirits attend to which celestial entities. You surround yourself only with worthy people, and you be firm in your confidence and only relate all of these matters to trustworthy people. You keep it secret. Keep it safe, as one wizard rightly advised. Again, all great advice, but still quite vague, still quite theoretical rather than practical in the idea of doing magic. And in his 1505 letter to Johannes Capellarius, the text of the Steganographia must already have been coming along, because at this point Capellarius actually requests to see some parts of it. Trithemius, for his part, now urges the would-be adept that he must now combine knowledge with love, the unconditional Christian love of God, the love for one's neighbors, and even the love that Christ teaches for one's enemies, in order that knowledge not be corrupted into vainglory. Here, Trithemius is linking his magical program with the long-standing mystical tradition that really originates in a significant sense with Bernard of Clairvaux. We now have a kind of dialectical process for the development of magical virtues and magical powers, which result, as I said, in quasi-divine magical powers, as laid out now in his 1505 letter of the same year to Ganet. Keep Ganet in mind, he's going to matter more in a minute. But Trithemius tells us that study generates knowledge, knowledge prepares love, love gives way to similarity, similarity to communion, communion to virtue, virtue to dignity, dignitas, dignitas to potentia, to power, and it is power that performs the miracle or the marvel. Indeed, this letter is a tour de force of magical theory, expertly combining much of Trithemius's inheritance of medieval occultism with the world of Renaissance arcana emerging from Italy. Specifically, Trithemius engages in an extended analysis of the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, employing a specifically Pythagorean Kabbalistic hermeneutic to it that's often difficult to follow. But here the tablet is understood to be describing the flowing out of all things from a primal unity, such that the progeny from that one bear at least some of the potential power of the primal one. And by returning to the one through spiritual, ethical, and epistemological purification, he akins this to the purifying fire of the alchemist, one can regain such lost divine powers. For Trithemius, this is the vera alchemia, the true alchemy, the combination of virtue, theory, and practice which eludes would-be alchemists, necromancers, and astrologers. Lacking all three, they simply prod about in the dark. All the while demonic influence and worldly temptations seek to stultify and eventually to damn them. Indeed, astrologers seek to find the fate of human beings in the stars, but this is also just both heretical and impossible. The human mind, and by extension the human will, is never affected by astral influence, a position that he may be adopting from Pico della Mirandola. Rather, astrological conditions provide the specific stage upon which free will, human wills, interact and produce the future. Thus, true astrology for Trithemius is prophetic rather than determinative of the human will. It denotes the historical conditions into which human beings will endure, but can never predict, much less determine, what any given will do. Indeed, the human mind has a kind of super-celestial link with astral bodies and entities, which precisely allows them a supernatural kind of causal relationship, as we'll see in just a minute. We kind of bypass astral power, even if we can pull it down and still use it terrestrially. But even in this period where Trithemius is still stitching together a radically new theory and practice, as we'll see in a moment, of magic, it's worth pointing out that this magic is not the end goal of his speculations. Rather, divine illumination, the illumination well known from the Christian tradition, is somehow both the means by which true magic, true alchemy, and true astrology are accomplished, but also the final goal, the final end game of the whole thing, the mystical vision which precedes the beatific vision following death. Trithemius wishes to restore a lost path back to the divine, where obtaining the powers of magic are a sign that one is truly on that road. Neither the sign nor the road are the point of the journey. Returning to the divine one is the ultimate goal for Trithemius. We're now in a position to begin to flesh out Trithemius's mature system of magic, a project that he very much self-modeled on a previous magus, his hero Albertus Magnus. But I want to do so not so much in the order of his literary output, but in the metaphysical, logical order, from more abstract cosmological theories and his theories of history to the more specific textbook and practice of the Steganographia. Thus, to start with, we should understand his De Septem Secundes, or on the seven secondaries, that is to say, the seven secondary intelligences, that is to say, the planetary intelligences to the primary intelligence, which is, of course, the divine. But to understand what he means by secondary intelligences, we need a little background in Aristotle, or at least how medieval people understood Aristotle. For the Stagirite, only entities with some degree of intelligence were capable of moving themselves. Well, the planets appeared to be moving, and thus something must be causing them to move, either themselves or an outside force, and there was a lot of medieval debate about just this topic. But following Peter Abano, Trithemius held that the planets were ruled and thus moved by angelic intelligences, the seven secondary intelligences. But using astrological data, along with the Bible, Trithemius reasoned that the world was created on March 15th, some 5,206 years before the coming of Christ, and counting conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in cycles, we know that these mark off periods of about 354 years or so, really 354.33 cycles, each ruled over by a specific angel, the first being Saturn and its angelic intelligence Orythiel. Thus, each cycle of 354 years finds a new planet and angel in dominion of the conditions of world history. If you're curious, we've been ruled by the sun and the angel Michael since November of 1879, which will give way again actually to Saturn and Orifiel again in March of 2233, the 22nd such cycle since creation. This text is most famous for not only grouping world history into a logical system of astral historical development, but also issuing forth a final ominous prediction. Just as Marshal Samael had ruled over the destruction of the world by the flood and the destruction of the Trojans, so too would the world be rent asunder before the end of that cycle in 1525. Specifically, Trithemius argued that, quote, a great religious sect would arise, and with it the destruction of the old religions. This new institution of religion would appear near the end of the epoch and result in that great loss of unity. Yeah, some people have thought that Trithemius is actually prophesying the coming Protestant Reformation. I mean, you could think about the Battle of Frankenhausen occurring in 1525. But beyond that date, he notes, the future of this series requires prophecy. But 2 points about all this astrological world history are key here. The first is that the secondary intelligences set the stage but don't force the actors. Free will is always completely intact in this system. And secondly, De Septem Secundis does allow for a rationalization of history as a cyclical process, at least weakly cyclical, by which the initiated could, with divine illumination, derive some sense of the future from the past. Thus, the source of prophecy wasn't only divine illumination, but some degree of arcane knowledge illuminated, as it were, and thus something we could actually learn and cultivated. You could make yourself into a prophet. Rather than being only chosen as a prophet, this is an arcane skill that could, at least in some sense, be learned. Finally, this system of the secondary angelic intelligences also sets the broadest possible stage for a much fuller development of angelic, or at least spiritual entities to populate the celestial spheres. Specifically, he subordinated to the 7 angelic intelligences, the secondary intelligences, 2 inferior realms of spirits. The first comprised of 31 or 32 regional or district spirits ruling over as many domains or mansions, tracking to the absolute cardinal and ordinal directions of the universe, sort of a rose direction compass of the universe, along with 11 or so wandering spirits. Then a second division comprised 24 more temporal spirits ruling over the astrological days and night. Beneath these he placed thousands of further spirits in various ranks of spiritual dukes, servants, commanders, companions, ministering spirits, all obscurely distributed from 70 quintillion spirits to just a dozen or so per grouping. And it would be through interacting with these spirits directly that would form the means and the mode of the steganographic art, which made Trithemius infamous. In 1503, during the course of both the theoretical and practical development of Trithemius's magical system of the Steganographia, he was paid a visit by the French scholar Carolus Bovilus, who was given access to a partially completed edition of that text. He was cordial during the visit, and Bovilus would eventually write to Germanus de Ganay, the same person that Trithemius was talking to, that same Ganay I mentioned a minute ago, that Trithemius was merely a magician, not in the least distinguished in philosophy. He detailed what he took to be hideous necromantic work, scrawling with spirits, or should I say demons, he writes, complete with sigils to conjure them, along with the means to do so. Finally, he linked Trithemius as closer to the pagan originator of magic, Zoroaster, than to any Christian saint. Trithemius had again blundered, breaking his own rule of only revealing true magic to those with eyes to understand what they beheld before them, and now he truly paid the price. That letter of Bovilus was given its own lurid details of necromancy gone wild, widely copied, and between the boisterous blunder of 1499 and the letter which began to rapidly circulate in 1506 or 1509, the dating of this letter seems corrupted, Trithemius's reputation as a necromancer took wings. Rumor fugit. Soon tales conflating Trithemius and Faust began to appear, such as him conjuring spirits of dead heroes, Even the wife of Emperor Maximilian I, Mary of Burgundy, began to circulate at this time. It's likely that at this time he also just abandoned work on the Steganographia after this public relations nightmare, and depending on how we date this letter, it also was probably the final straw in the relationship with his brothers in the abbey. They were just tired of him either being known as a necromancer or just doing angel magic. Around this time, he also was forced out of the abbey at Sponheim, forced to abandon most, if not all, of his prize library. So what about the Steganographia was just so foul, so evil to foment such turmoil? It isn't clear when Trithemius began work on the Steganographia, to be honest, but probably sometime around the turn of the 16th century, usually dated to like 1499. He aimed it to be several volumes, and it would be an art by which you could create unbreakable ciphers, to learn Latin in only a couple of hours, the ability to conjure angels and employ them to instantly dispatch secret messages over vast distances, and even to transmit one's thoughts over those vast distances, even into the most secure dungeon, even into the Tomb of Horrors. An art which would eventually illuminate the soul itself, according to right Catholic principles, he said, and through perfectly natural means. Though recall that even natural magic for Trithemius always has some underlying supernatural assisting agent, either an angel or a demon, and Trithemius inconveniently does not tell us how to distinguish between the two. As the book survives, it consists of 2 complete books and an incomplete third. The first details the employ of 31 or 32 regional or district spirits ruling over as many domains or mansions, tracking to the absolute cardinal and ordinal directions of the universe. In addition, there are some 11 or so wandering dukes, which are not directional and usually have to do with the elements or regions of the earth or the underworld. The next deals with a second division comprising 24 temporal spirits ruling over the hours of the day and night. The final book would have dealt with the 3 spirits of the 7 planetary angels or planetary spirits, beginning with Saturn, and that section alone was completed. The first 2 books ostensibly detail the means by which to transmit a message through angelic means. The format for both books 1 and 2 are pretty similar. They're spirit registers. Here there is a header with a specific spirit along with their assistants or entourage, and columns printed in red and black, at least in later editions, or at least denoted as such in earlier editions, and it details how to employ these spirits to dispatch a secret message. It includes the appropriate sigil of the spirit, the opening conjuration. Later editions would include a cryptographic key, more on that in just a minute, and along with draft letters written by Trithemius to display the cryptographic method that he has in mind, and finally a conjuration by which to return a message through angelic means. In the first book, these angels or spirits are described beginning facing east and working clockwise, east, southeast, etc., all the way back to east-northeast, denoted by the classical winds and the specific spirits involved. Let's work through a brief example using the east-southeast spirit of Padiel with 10,000 diurnal spirits and 200,000 nocturnal spirit ministers with many others beside. We learned that unlike the first spirit of the east, which are troublesome spirits and not for beginners, they cause all kinds of problems, these are relatively easy to work with. These ones of the east-southeast are kind, quiet, and tranquil. So we face the direction of the spirit's mansion, east-southeast in this case. We invoke the spirit with the supplied conjuration, and upon their appearance, we finish the letter that we're writing out that we want to dispatch. We attach the appropriate spirit sigil and dispatch the plain text of the addressee of our message with a specific address. Again, the plain text doesn't matter. Padiel and his spirits are actually going to convey the real message of our minds to the recipient. The receiver, then recognizing the correct sigil, turns east-southeast and recites another conjuration whereby the true message will be revealed. It's of note that Padiel and his spirits are best for, quote, announcing secret advice for the correction, imprisonment, and punishment of malefactors. Further, Trithemius lays out a set of very specific rules for anyone wishing to employ the steganographic art. The sender and the receiver must engage studiously with all of the art, all the while maintaining strict esoteric secrecy. One must become intimately familiar with the world of the spirits, their location, their ranks, their position, their tasks, and their specialties. I suspect this also has something to do with maintaining some degree of secrecy, given that you don't want to have elaborate charts of spirits and textbooks of their invocations just lying around for anyone to see, for the Inquisition to see. So you need to commit a lot of this to memory. Further, Trithemius insists that the conjurations be strictly adhered to and not altered at all. They have to be learned perfectly and pronounced properly, probably to interrupt the seemingly inevitable creep of gibberish into them via the game of occult telephone that always occurs in these textbooks. The steganographic art also should be employed with only the strictest secrecy is required. You shouldn't just use it to send DMs to that hottie. And the transmission of the messages should be taken with all due seriousness. Again, not to send to creep in someone's DMs. Again, Trithemius stresses that understanding the nature of the spirits involved and to perform this art only in private because the spirits, quote, detest and flee the throng of men and they hate public gatherings. I'm kind of like one of those spirits. Finally, one must take extreme care in copying the specific sigil of the spirit being invoked. Unlike many other grimoires where spirits often have elaborate sigils, those of the steganographic art are often very subtle, probably meant to appear as simply a medieval abbreviation or flourish to the untrained eye. Thus, we have the means and the mode by which to engage in the steganographic art. Now, each chapter is a little bit different in the particulars, but overall, this is the gist of the book. The second book deals with specifically the spirits of the planetary hours of the day and night, not the fixed hours of a 24-hour cycle. And the third book deals with the specific spirits of the ruling planets and their attendant angels, for which a given day must be divided into quarterly planetary hours. For our solar period, that would be Michael in the first hour and Paphael, Vanriel, and Zabdiel following respectively. Though, again, only Trithemius lays out Saturn in his book. Of course, as you progress through the text, one no longer has to write down the plain text to dispatch it via a messenger. The angels just communicate it directly, as if through angelic telepathy. It's as if the more carefully one tunes one's astrological timings, the greater power one has to directly communicate via the angels. And while we know that the book was planned to have some 8 or more sections, with some manuscripts boasting of a spurious 4th book, only 2.5 of them are extant. Regardless, as we've seen, the book inspired a complete scandal, and in turn, profound interest for anyone interested and inclined to occult knowledge. And for good reason. What Trithemius seems to have developed is a universal system of history built upon a highly structured angelology, which unites classical astrology from which a range of magical operations are possible, including virtually instantaneous secret communication. And what person interested in the occult, or just any politician, isn't interested in that? And to his credit, Trithemius is self-aware of this fact. The book is dedicated to the most serene prince, Lord Philip, Count Palatine of the Rhine, Duke of Bavaria, and Prince Elector of the Holy Roman Empire. He's cozying up to become the DOD, or the Secret Intelligence Bureau of the Holy Roman Empire, and it's clearly meant to extend the knowledge of the Kabbalah to the state for obvious ends of statecraft and espionage. Again, he's setting himself up as the leader of the KGB. Trithemius is offering the Holy Roman Empire an information theory centuries before Claude Shannon. A strange theory of information, but a theory of the storage, processing, and utilization of information just the same. It's astro-angelic TCP/IP with an adjunct for a protocol with secure connectivity. This is something like angelic information theory centuries before Claude Shannon. But the cat was out of the bag, and with Trithemius facing serious scrutiny both inside and outside the world of his cloister, it seems that he abandoned the specific project of the Steganographia. But this would be by no means signal the end of his interest in both the illumination of the soul and the relationship of that process to something like we might identify as cryptography. And by 1508, Trithemius had produced another textbook on secret writing, now totally devoid of the elaborate system of angelic dispatch. But the preface and dedication, along with his tracing the history of secret writing, make it clear that engaging in the polygraphic art is also a spiritual exercise. How? Because of the deeply Kabbalistic conception of language that he has actually maintained from the Steganographia In the Polygraphia, Trithemius maintains that language, given that it flows as a multiplicity from the one, literally many languages from the period from before the confusion of the languages following the Tower of Babel, reflects the underlying metaphysical reality of the monad giving birth to diversity. Again, we have this metaphysical, linguistic angle on a kind of Pythagorean point. For him, manipulating the multiplicity of language points us back in the direction of a primal language, and that linguistic or cryptographic process is an echo, a mirror of the spiritual process happening in our souls. Thus, the manipulation of language through the polygraphic art allows our soul to reach back to that Adamical, pre-lapsarian language through which speech and being were united. And from that linguistic leap of the many to the one, can the soul also be aided in that journey? The polygraphic art shows the way to infinity as he has it. Again, while the book itself is seemingly free of occult themes, with a couple of exceptions I'll come back to in just a second, the spiritual motivation of its composition remains deeply Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Pythagorean. The manipulation of language is metaphysical because the relationship between semiotics, or representation, and ontology, or being, are fused for Trithemius. Locking and unlocking codes, ciphers, the manipulation of arcane symbols, etc., are also always means by which we can turn inward and purify and elevate our own souls. And for what it's worth, the text also produced an alphabet attributed to Honorius of Thebes, the magical use of which became the Theban or witches' alphabet, as popularized by dozens of magical textbooks down to this day. Further, he also deploys some alchemical symbols or deknomen, which again could be used as a kind of cryptic alphabet. Again, while the text doesn't employ the elaborate system of angel conjuration of the Steganographia, it is by no means sterile of occult material or spirituality. It was, as he had it, secular consequence of the ability of the soul, especially empowered by God, by magical means to reach earth to heaven. Again, the polygraphic art still shares the same fundamental occult aspirations, the mystical aspirations of the Steganographia. And despite his attempt to distance himself from more explicit magical writings in occult philosophy, Trithemius' reputation was sealed by the first decade of the 16th century. So much so that when a young Heinrich of Nettesheim in his early 20s at the time produced a grand synthesis of the occult philosophy in 1510, he would vet it by the now abbot of St. James at Würzburg. This three-part lengthy essay, at least in 1510, would be greatly expanded and eventually published by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa in 1533 as the Three Books of Occult Philosophy. And in it we have the wonderful correspondence between the youthful Agrippa and the kindly but careful abbot encourage him to soar upwards toward the divine like a bird rather than dwell among the ignorant cows, the boves, no doubt a punning jab at Bovilus, whose letter to Gannet had so marred Trithemius' reputation. And true to fashion, his April 15 letter urges Agrippa to keep up his work and keep his ideas from the eyes of the ignorant. Amazingly, the very manuscript of the occult philosophy as it was known survives to this day in the Würzburg library. And aside from reprinting the Theban alphabet along with several other mystical ciphers, Agrippa's entire occult philosophy is infused with Trithemius' spiritual aims of divine illumination and its attending magical powers. Agrippa was clearly the intellectual and spiritual heir of Trithemius. Along with Agrippa, it's also said that that great alchemical iconoclast, you can say his name with me if you like, Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, Paracelsus, also studied with Trithemius, but the evidence here is far more circumstantial, and I think it's more that Trithemius inspired Paracelsianism more than Paracelsus studied with Trithemius. Now, with a reputation as a necromancer, despite his autobiographical defense of magic and himself in the 1507 Nepiacus, tension with Maximilius over a 1611 church council, and yet continuing to work on his monumental textbooks of monastic history and Saxon chronology, Trithemius would pass from this world in 1516 at the age of 54. He would not live to see his occult works printed. The Polygraphia saw its first printing in 1518, his astrological history of the world went to the press in 1545, and the infamous Steganographia would be printed in 1608, before going on the Index of Prohibited Books in 1609, right after the 1608 edition. And the controversy over the Abbot of Sponheim would only continue to rage through the centuries. The monastic world would defend him, at least his non-magical works, and sought to rescue him, as it were, from himself in their apologies. Demonologists of both Catholic and Protestant stripes would label his magical works outright diabolical heresy or just silly superstition. For the Protestants, including Martin Luther himself, Trithemius became the poster boy for how melancholic monasticism lured even the most learned and pious into necromancy and damnation. Indeed, they argued it was more proof of popish superstition and even diabolical expressions of Antichrist within the Catholic Church itself. If Trithemius was the most learned and he still went to magic, what does that say about the Church, they argued. For the Catholics' part, Jean Baudin condemned Trithemius' work as filled with prayers to demons. The Bishop Antonio Zara condemned De Septem Secundis as noting that the concept of intelligences cleaving to the heavens must be completely rejected. Literally, he writes, exploda. It needs to be exploded. The Jesuit demonologist, perhaps the most learned demonologist of the entire period, Martin del Rio, would condemn Trithemius, along with Agrippa, in his monumental 1599 investigations into magic, and it became the true intellectual and spiritual heir of the Malleus Maleficarum. Further, as I mentioned, the Steganographia was banned in 1609, and for the humanists, they felt that at best the cryptographic elements of his work could be salvaged, but the rest was basically dangerous nonsense. And for centuries, he was hailed as the father of modern cryptography, all the while ignoring the trappings of all that, pesky, occult, angel magic stuff. We don't like any of that stuff because we're enlightened. Speaking of those occult elements, those were features, not bugs, for, the occultists of the time. As soon as the book appeared in manuscript, it was sought after by those interested in the occult arts en masse. And judging by its far-spread reputation and representation in surviving manuscripts, the text was clearly in high demand. Famously, Dr. John Dee noted that it was a book for which 1,000 crowns could be offered and yet could not be obtained. A book for which many a learned man has long sought and daily does seek, a book whose use is greater than its spread fame. The Steganographia, a book for your honor or a prince so needful and so commodious as in human knowledge none could be meeter or more behoveful. So high praise for Dr. John Dee, and Dee would eventually hand copy the volume in Antwerp in 1563, and then again copy it in 1593 when that volume was lost, and that partial copy from 1593 still survives in the National Library of Wales. Of course, 1563 is an important date in the occult works of John Dee, and given the Kabbalistic and Pythagorean nature of the Steganographia, it's unsurprising to see those exact details and language deployed to explain his own Monas Hieroglyphica, a symbol by which to manipulate all of reality, published only a year later in 1564. Thus, there is a direct intellectual and spiritual through line from Trithemius to John Dee. In fact, when True and Faithful Relation was published in 1659, detailing the spiritual conversation between Dee and Kelly and all those weird angels, Kelly is depicted as studying Trithemius. Of course, Dee wouldn't be alone in being impacted by the Steganographia. Giovanni Battista della Porta's 1563 Handbook on Cryptography would be directly influenced by the book. Along with the Polygraphia, the Paracelsians and the would-be Rosicrucian cadres like Jacques Gahory, Gerard Dorm, Boissard, Robert Flood, Athanasius Kircher, and the famed English astrologer William Lilly, who actually translated on the secondary 7 intelligences to English for the first time and only time that I know of, all of these, among many, many others, would become enthusiastic followers of Trithemius for various ends, whether they be cryptographic, magical, astrological, or all of the above, even as a means of healing the great rift between the Protestants and the Catholics, who were kind of Christianity reformed along Hermetic lines. Thus, Trithemius was claimed as a founding member of the emergent Rosicrucian Enlightenment, and even in Cartesian circles and in the English Royal Society, not so much a bastion of occultism, though more than you would think, actually, Trithemius was praised if only for his contributions to the emergent science of cryptography by people like Robert Hooke. Thus, his actual ideas endured, and when that failed, he became a kind of projection board for the dreams and aspirations of generations that followed him. In effect, Trithemius has become the icon of occult knowledge for the early modern period. And there is perhaps no better expression of this than in the compilation that becomes the most important, if not one of the most important, books of magic of that entire period down till now. The Lemegeton, the Lesser Key of Solomon. Following the demonic register of the Goetia, which is admittedly the most popular section of that book, we find the Theurgia Goetia and the Ars Paulina, and these texts detail the 32 spirits of the compass points, the wandering dukes, and of the astrological hours of the day and night. Yeah, these two infamous grimoires are actually using the spirit registers found in Book 1 and 2 of the Steganographia, but adding hosts of sigils for all of these spirits with a specific eye to their general conjuration. Rather than being restricted to transmitting messages, these grimoires now greatly expand upon the scope of what can be accomplished through the conjuration of these spirits. Thus, the Steganographia becomes the blueprint for one of the most important operational books of magic in the modern and contemporary period. It goes from being specifically about conjuring angels to deploy messages to magic writ large. Indeed, it is possible that the entire collection that becomes the Lemegeton, or the Lesser Key of Solomon, was already housed in situ at Sponheim, outlined in a list of condemned magical texts by Trithemius in his Antipulus Maleficiorum. And I've actually done a whole episode on that forbidden list of magical books if you want to check it out, but I do think in ovo all those books are there in some sense. Thus, Trithemius' impact on the development of Western magic, from the Renaissance down to chaos magic and Aleister Crowley and the Golden Dawn, all of it, he may be ground zero for the lion's share of what became contemporary occultism. And this may all have been one giant misunderstanding, one of the greatest tricks ever pulled in the history of the occult. After Trithemius was accused of consorting with demonic spirits, various clave Steganographia began to appear and were appended always to the printed editions. What they reveal is alarming. The names of many of the spirits and their conjurations are simply covers for instructions for a dizzying array of encryption techniques. Let's go back to our second spirit of the East-Southeast, Padiel. So I've taken his conjuration as it appears in the original 1606 printing and applied the specific key which tells us to skip every other word, reading every other letter, with the first and last words being of the conjuration basically being nulls, the angel names here being nulls. What this reveals is a phrase reading something like, the first letter of, then it's garbled, the rest may speak the art. Similarly, the second conjuration allegedly to be used by the receiver has to, quote, take the alternating first letters. Again, there's some garbling here. And sure enough, when we look at Trithemius' example message, skipping the introduction and then reading the first letter of each alternating word, what do we find? Beneath the Latin plain text, a fine prayer for the mercy of Christ, we find a message in the German vernacular warning us that the bearer of the message has committed some serious mishap and should be detained until our arrival. Remember what Padiel specializes in? Makes sense now. Another example using a similar encoding method holds a secret text detailing a secret late-night meeting. In effect, the names of the spirits are seemingly nothing more than the specific names for a wide range of encryption techniques. Reduced to that, there doesn't appear to be any angel magic here at all. And this seems to be true for each and every spirit of the Steganographia. Of course, it's clear from the manuscript to the printing process some degree of corruption has snuck in, meaning that the conjurations have become somewhat garbled. This shouldn't be surprising to us because, one, we see this in the transmission of grimoires just generally, and two, with the text being asemic, the compositors were likely just to make mistakes. Long S's look like F's. B's and P's get flipped, M's and N's, Also, Trithemius seemed to have worried about just this possibility. Remember all those steganographic rules about being extremely precise in the angel names, and especially in the conjurations? I suspect that it wasn't so much about magic, but perhaps about preventing the corruption of the encryption keys so as to preserve the integrity of the system overall. And yet, despite the corruption, the Steganographia was revealed to contain a handbook of cryptography concealed beneath a veneer of angel magic. Even the incomplete third book was revealed to contain an elaborate substitution cipher by Jim Reeds in 1998. I remember being a teenager when he published that paper. The same scholar, by the way, that discovered the means of encipherment used in John Dee's Book of Soyga. And it's worth mentioning that Dee, despite his work in espionage and codes and mathematics, never seems to have really worked out how any of these codes work so far as we can tell. But we're faced with a real conundrum here. How do we square everything Trithemius has said about magic in all his other writings with what appears to be an essentially non-magical book on cryptography? Clearly, Trithemius was not only deeply interested in magic, but was also convinced that its reformation was an essential task of the pious. Yet, the Steganographia just doesn't seem to be performing that task. But, and this is important as well, why in the world would you conceal your book on cryptography beneath the appearance of a forbidden book on angel magic? This seems to be a shockingly dangerous choice of medium, a veneer that could not only ruin one's reputation, which it did to Trithemius, but could just land you before the Inquisition being burned alive. Of all the cover text to choose, it's a daring, if not completely reckless decision. And yet, it's a convincing one. Convinced even John Dee. Why? Because probably Trithemius is actually basing the angel magic cover on an actual text of angel magic from his library, the ancestor of which would become the Theurgia Goetia and the Ars Paulina and the Lesser Key of Solomon. So it's a convincing cover because it's actually using magic, at least to some significant degree, to hide the whole encryption system. But do we need to choose between cryptography or magic in all of this? Recall that Trithemius' discussion of the illuminative power of the Kabbalah of language in his later Polygraphy? Remember all that business about how it can lead you to the infinite? Remember there he argued that manipulating language would be spiritually restorative. And of course, the relationship between language and metaphysics was anything other than arbitrary, unlike in contemporary semiotics. For this whole school of Pythagorean, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, occult philosophers, I suspect the same spiritual sentiments raised by Trithemius in the preface to the later Polygraphia would also apply to the combination of angel magic and cryptography of the printed Steganographia. Thus, I think some scholars, and magic practitioners for that matter, have been forced into a false dichotomy when evaluating the nature of the Steganographia. Is it angel magic, or is it cryptography? I suspect the answer is strangely both. But that's only possible to appreciate if we locate the text within the broader landscape of Trithemius' philosophical, cryptographic, and spiritual projects. Recall that Trithemius, quote, furnished the secret of the polygraphic art with the data and promised to enlarge this art so as to make it known to mortals, even to infinity. But all those things which language is able to express, the soul is able to ponder, and indeed, finitis modum dedimus ad infinita. To the finite, we are showing a way to infinity. I think we must apply the totality of his occult spirituality to the Steganographia to understand that cryptography and intellectual illumination through a veneer of angel magic is still deeply spiritual for Trithemius. So we need not choose. It's angel magic and cryptography as a road of spiritual illumination. One of my intellectual heroes, the scholar of alchemy Adam MacLean, notes that Trithemius was, quote, perhaps the central figure in the evolution of the Western esoteric tradition. And I largely agree. Is there Agrippa's 1533 mature occult philosophy, or John Dee's elaborate world of Enochiana and manipulation of symbols and metaphysics without Trithemius? Do Paracelsianism and Rosicrucianism, the elaborate Neo-Hermeticism of Robert Flood, emerge in the same way? Is there a lesser of Keo Solomon that transforms English occultism without Trithemius, and therefore directly influencing Aleister Crowley? Is there an overlap in the occult and ciphers in the Golden Dawn, literally using one of Trithemius's codes, or the codes of Crowley's Book of the Law without the linkage of the encoded and the occult? Have many of you written in the alphabet of the witches in your Book of Shadows as practitioners of Wicca? If the answer is yes, then I don't think there's a world outside of Trithemius. Even if you've just sent an email today, you've sent a DM, you've texted someone, even outside of the world of the occult, every message that we transmit electronically, especially those encrypted, have their ancestor in the melange of cryptography and angel magic laid out by Ars Steganographia. Trithemius, along with the legends and projections that have grown up around him and upon him, are simply decisive in the development of Western esotericism. So why isn't he better known? Trithemius is simply too Christian for the occultists, too superstitiously medieval for the data scientists, and he's too occultists for the Christians. He's a misfit, and thus he is a perfect fit here at Esoterica. Noel Braun has written 2 magisterial studies of Trithemius, and his work on the magical theology of Trithemius is simply required reading if you're interested in Western esotericism at all. However, the occult works of Trithemius continue basically to languish in obscurity. His Polygraphia has not been translated to my knowledge, nor his key letters on magic. On the 7 Secondary Intelligences was translated into English way back by William Lilly in 1647, and that translation can be found online, but clearly needs to be updated. The wonderful Dr. Stephen Skinner and Daniel Clark have produced an edition of the Steganographia, though I do say that it should be read with some degree of caution, and I agree with Daniel Harms's assessment of it, which I'll link below. Though I do hear that Scott Gosnell, who's done some fine work on Giordano Bruno, is working on a translation as well, so I'm looking forward to seeing that. Also, Frater Acher has produced a fine study of the teachers of Trithemius and some other Trithemian material that I want to come back to at a future time. Thus, we're by no means done with Trithemius. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for coming with me on this journey, this hour-long, more than an hour-long journey into the history of this person who I think is incredibly impressive and important in the history of esotericism. And thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.